Look at any old photograph from 100 years ago, one with a crowded street in it, and count the jobs you cannot name. The boy running between buildings with a block of ice on his shoulder. The man walking down the street lighting each gas lamp one by one as the sun goes down. The woman standing behind glass switching wires by hand so two strangers on opposite sides of the country could hear each other's voices. These were not rare occupations. These were entire industries, employing millions of Americans, structuring entire neighborhoods, and entire family lives around a single trade that simply does not exist anymore. Most of them did not fade away slowly. Most of them were wiped out within a decade or two by a single piece of new technology, and the people who had spent their whole working lives mastering a trade woke up one morning to find it gone. So what did these jobs actually involve? How many people really did them? And which one of these vanished trades employed more Americans, at its peak, than almost any job you could name today? We are counting down 20 forgotten American jobs that no longer exist, roughly from the 1800s through the mid-20th century, before machines, electricity, and new technology quietly erased them one by one. One honest word before we start. Old labor statistics from 100 or more years ago are not always precise. Record-keeping varied wildly by state and by industry, and plenty of these trades blur together at the edges with similar-sounding jobs. So take the numbers as a solid general picture, not an exact census. What is certain is that every single job on this list was once common enough that a child growing up in that era would have known someone who did it, and today most Americans have never even heard the job title spoken out loud. Number 20. The knocker-up. This one belonged more to industrial England than America, but it crossed the Atlantic into American mill towns and mining communities wherever factory shifts started before dawn and alarm clocks were too expensive or too unreliable for a working family to trust. A knocker-up walked the streets in the dark carrying a long pole, tapping on bedroom windows at the exact hour each customer had paid to be woken, moving from house to house on a fixed route that had to be memorized perfectly, because waking the wrong house or missing one entirely could cost a man his job at the mill. The trade survived in scattered American factory towns into the early 1900s, until the cheap wind-up alarm clock finally made the whole profession unnecessary almost overnight. Number 19. The lamplighter. Before electric streetlights, American cities and towns depended on gas lamps lining every major street, and every one of those lamps had to be lit by hand each evening and extinguished again each morning. A lamplighter walked a fixed route through his section of town carrying a long pole with a small flame, or a hook at the end, timing his walk precisely so that lamps lit up roughly in sequence as darkness fell across the neighborhood. In large cities like New York and Boston, lamplighting was a respected, unionized trade employing thousands of men, passed down within families who held the same city routes for generations. Electric streetlights began replacing gas lamps in major American cities through the 1880s and 90s, and by the 1920s the profession had all but vanished from anywhere with a real power grid. Number 18. The ice cutter. Before mechanical refrigeration, an enormous seasonal industry existed purely to harvest ice from frozen lakes and ponds each winter, cut it into large blocks, and store it in sawdust-packed ice houses to be sold through the warm months ahead. Ice cutters worked in dangerous conditions on frozen lake surfaces, using long saws and specialized tools to score and cut the ice into uniform blocks that could weigh several hundred pounds each, then hauled the blocks by horse-drawn sledge to storage houses built specifically to keep them frozen for months. New England became the center of a massive commercial ice trade in the 1800s, shipping frozen lake ice as far as the Caribbean and even India in refrigerated ship holds. The invention of practical mechanical refrigeration in the early 1900s slowly strangled the entire industry, and by the 1930s, natural ice harvesting had all but disappeared from American commerce. Number 17. The icemen. Separate from the cutters who harvested the ice were the icemen who delivered it, a job so common in American cities through the early 1900s that nearly every household with an icebox, the wooden predecessor to the modern refrigerator, depended on a regular delivery. An iceman drove a horse-drawn or later motorized wagon through his route, carrying large blocks with heavy metal tongs directly into customers' kitchens, judging by how much ice each family needed based on the size of their icebox and how quickly their last block had melted. Children in many American neighborhoods famously chased the ice wagon on hot summer days, begging for the small ice chips that fell off during cutting. The rise of the electric home refrigerator through the 1920s and 30s ended the trade almost entirely within a single generation. Number 16. The switchboard operator. In the earliest decades of the telephone, no call could connect automatically. Every single one had to be manually routed by an operator sitting at a large switchboard, physically plugging and unplugging cables to link one caller's line to another. This became one of the largest employers of American women in the early 20th century, with hundreds of thousands working the boards at the peak of the industry, memorizing patterns of customer requests, and moving with practiced speed through thousands of connections during a single shift. Operators were trained to speak in a specific, polished, professional tone that became so recognizable it developed its own name in the industry, the telephone operator's voice. Automatic dial switching technology, introduced gradually from the 1920s onward and expanding rapidly after World War II, eliminated the need for manual operators almost entirely by the 1970s. Number 15. The elevator operator. For decades, riding an elevator meant stepping into a small cab controlled entirely by a uniformed operator who worked a manual lever to start, stop, and align the car precisely with each floor, a skill that actually required real training and real judgment, because stopping even slightly off level could leave a dangerous gap between the elevator floor and the building floor. Elevator operators became a familiar fixture in American department stores, hotels, and office buildings, often expected to announce each floor and its shops or offices by memory as the car rose. The introduction of automatic push-button elevators through the 1950s and 60s gradually made trained human operators unnecessary, though a small number of buildings, mostly for tradition or ceremony, kept the job alive well past when it was technically needed. Number 14. The pinsetter. Before automatic pinsetting machines, every single bowling alley in America depended on young workers, often boys, standing at the end of each lane to manually reset the pins after every single throw and return the ball down a wooden track to the bowler. The work was fast, repetitive, and genuinely dangerous. Pinsetters had to move quickly to avoid being struck by wildly bouncing pins or a fast-moving ball, and long shifts left many with real physical strain from the constant bending and lifting. Pinsetting was one of the most common part-time jobs available to American teenage boys through the 1940s and 50s, a first-paying job for an entire generation. The automatic pinsetter machine, patented in the late 1930s and widely adopted through the 1950s, eliminated the job almost entirely within about a decade. Number 13. The milkman. In the early and mid-20th century, nearly every American household received fresh milk delivered directly to the doorstep several times a week, carried by a milkman driving a specially built delivery wagon or truck loaded with glass bottles that customers would rinse and leave out to be collected and reused. The trade required genuinely intimate local knowledge. A good milkman memorized not just his customers' addresses but their individual orders, extra cream for one house, buttermilk for another, and often served as an early morning fixture in a neighborhood's daily rhythm, sometimes even noticed if something seemed wrong at a house along his route. The rise of home refrigeration, supermarket chains, and longer-lasting packaging through the 1950s and 60s steadily pulled customers away from doorstep delivery, and by the 1970s the daily milkman had become rare enough to feel like a relic even to people who remembered him clearly. Number 12. The telegraph operator. Long before the telephone reached most American homes, the telegraph was the fastest way to send a message across long distances, and every message depended entirely on a trained operator who could send and receive Morse code by ear, tapping out messages letter by letter on a small brass key and translating incoming clicks back into words fast enough to write them down in real time. Telegraph offices sat in nearly every American town of any size, often inside the railroad depot, and operators became trusted local figures who handled everything from business orders to news of a death in the family, sometimes the first person in town to know important news before anyone else. Skilled operators could send and receive dozens of words per minute, a genuine specialized skill that took years to master. The spread of the telephone through the early 20th century, and later the teletype machine, steadily reduced demand for manual Morse code operators, and the trade had mostly disappeared from everyday American life by the mid-1900s. Number 11. The rat catcher. In American cities before modern pest control, professional rat catchers were hired by municipalities, businesses, and sometimes wealthy households to control rodent populations that spread disease and destroyed stored food and goods. These men developed real specialized skill, using trained dogs, traps, poison, and detailed knowledge of how rats move through a building's walls and sewers, and some became local celebrities of a strange sort, known for the sheer size of the rat populations they had cleared from a particular warehouse district or tenement block. The job carried real risk, since disease exposure was constant, and rat catchers were among the first to notice and report outbreaks of illness tied to rodent infestation. The rise of modern chemical pest control companies and improved sanitation infrastructure through the 20th century steadily replaced the freelance rat catcher with organized commercial pest control services. Number 10. The soda jerk. Behind the counter of nearly every American drugstore and ice cream parlor through the early and mid-20th century stood the soda jerk, a job named for the sharp, practiced jerking motion used to pull the handle on a soda fountain tap. Soda jerks mix sodas, milkshakes, malts, and ice cream sundaes entirely by hand, memorizing dozens of specific drink recipes and often developing a showy, fast-paced style of pouring and mixing meant to entertain customers sitting at the counter. The job became one of the most common first jobs for American teenagers through the 1940s and 50s, tied closely to the culture of the soda fountain as a social gathering spot for young people. As supermarket beverage aisles expanded and traditional drugstore soda fountains gradually closed through the 1960s and 70s, the soda jerk faded out along with the counters they once worked behind. Number 9. The town crier. Carried over from English tradition into early American colonial towns, the town crier walked the streets ringing a bell and calling out public announcements, official proclamations, local news, and sometimes commercial notices, at a time when most residents could not read and no local newspaper reliably reached every household. A good crier needed a genuinely powerful, clear voice able to carry over street noise and be heard from a distance, and the specific phrase used to open an announcement became a recognized signal that important news was coming. As literacy rates rose and local newspapers became widely available through the 1800s, the practical need for a town crier steadily declined, and by the mid-19th century the role survived in most American towns only as ceremonial tradition rather than genuine public necessity. Number 8. The cooper. A cooper built and repaired wooden barrels, casks, and buckets, an occupation absolutely essential to nearly every industry in early America, since barrels were the standard shipping and storage container for everything from flour and salted meat to gunpowder, nails, and whiskey. The trade required real skill. A cooper had to shape individual wooden staves so precisely that when bound together with iron hoops they formed a perfectly watertight container without any nails or glue holding the wood itself together. Entire towns depended on a local cooper for their economic survival, since a village without one had nowhere to properly store or ship its goods. The rise of cardboard packaging, steel drums, and later plastic containers through the late 1800s and early 1900s steadily eliminated the demand for hand-built wooden barrels, and by the mid-20th century the traditional cooper trade had become a rare specialty craft rather than a common necessity. Number 7. The telephone booth attendant. In busy American cities through the early and mid-20th century, some large telephone exchanges and public buildings employed attendants specifically to manage the flow of customers using public telephone booths, making change, directing people to available booths, and sometimes helping place long-distance calls that required special handling through an operator. This was a genuinely narrow, specialized job that existed mainly in the busiest urban centers, where public telephone use was heavy enough to require dedicated staff just to keep the lines moving efficiently. As direct dial technology expanded and public phone booths became simpler self-service machines through the mid-20th century, the dedicated attendant role quietly disappeared, folded into general building staff duties or eliminated entirely. Number 6. The typesetter. Before computer publishing, every single newspaper, book, and printed document in America had to be assembled letter by a trained typesetter, either arranging individual metal letters by hand in the earliest days of printing or later operating large mechanical typesetting machines like the linotype, which cast entire lines of text in molten metal at genuinely impressive speed for a skilled operator. Typesetting was a respected, well-paid trade requiring years to master, and skilled typesetters were essential employees at every newspaper in the country, often working through the night to have the morning edition ready on time. The introduction of computer-based photo typesetting and later digital publishing through the 1970s and 80s rapidly eliminated the need for traditional metal typesetting, and within about 2 decades an entire skilled trade that had existed for centuries essentially vanished from the American workplace. Number 5. The powder monkey. Though more associated with naval history, the term and the role persisted into certain American industrial and mining contexts through the 19th century, referring to workers, often disturbingly young boys, tasked with handling and transporting gunpowder and later dynamite in dangerous industrial settings like quarries and mines. The job demanded steady hands and genuine bravery, since a single mistake handling volatile explosives could be fatal, and the workers who did it were often chosen specifically for their small size, which let them move quickly through tight spaces carrying charges to where they were needed. As safety regulations tightened through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and specialized adult blasting crews with formal training became standard practice in American mining and construction, the informal use of young powder handlers was gradually phased out entirely. Number 4. The seamstress working for a department store fitting room. Before ready-to-wear clothing became standard, most American department stores through the early 20th century employed staff seamstresses on site, whose entire job was altering purchased garments to fit each individual customer perfectly, taking in a waistline, shortening a hem, adjusting a shoulder seam, often within the same visit a customer made to buy the item. This was skilled, detailed handwork requiring years of training, and a good store seamstress developed a genuine reputation among regular customers who requested her specifically. As mass-produced, standardized sizing became the industry norm through the mid-20th century, and alterations shifted towards smaller independent tailor shops rather than in-house department store staff. The dedicated store seamstress position steadily disappeared from most major American retailers. Number 3. The chimney sweep working American residential routes. Before the widespread adoption of oil, gas, and electric heating, most American homes depended on wood or coal-burning fireplaces and stoves, and every one of those needed regular chimney cleaning to prevent dangerous soot buildup and the very real risk of chimney fires. Chimney sweeps, often small, thin men or in some cases still children in the earliest decades of the trade, climbed directly into chimneys with brushes and scrapers to clear them by hand, a filthy, physically demanding job that carried real health risks from constant soot and smoke exposure. The trade remained genuinely necessary in American cities and towns well into the early 20th century, tied to the changing seasons as families prepared their heating systems for winter. The gradual shift towards central heating systems fueled by oil, gas, and electricity through the mid-20th century steadily reduced the need for the traditional chimney sweep, pushing the trade into the rare specialty service it remains today. Number 2. The human alarm clock at the railroad depot. In towns built around railroad schedules, some depots employed a dedicated worker whose entire job was tracking arrival and departure times precisely and personally notifying key staff, mail handlers, freight loaders, and sometimes specific waiting passengers, when their particular train was approaching, since public address systems and reliable clocks were not yet standard everywhere. This was a job built entirely on trust and precision. A depot that ran late or missed a connection because of a missed notification could lose real business and real reputation. As standardized clocks, telegraph-coordinated schedules, and later public address systems became common across the American rail network through the early 20th century, the dedicated human timekeeper role at smaller depots quietly folded into general station staff duties. Number 1. The lector, the reader in the cigar factory. This is one of the strangest and most genuinely moving forgotten trades in American labor history. In cigar factories across cities like Tampa and Key West, largely staffed by Cuban and Spanish immigrant workers through the late 1800s and early 1900s, a lector was hired and paid collectively by the workers themselves to sit on an elevated platform in the middle of the factory floor and read aloud for hours at a time while everyone else rolled cigars by hand. Lectors read newspapers, political essays, and full-length novels, and their choices genuinely shaped the political consciousness of an entire immigrant workforce. Some cigar rollers later credited the lector tradition with introducing them to major literature and radical political ideas they would never have otherwise encountered. Factory owners eventually grew uneasy with the politically charged material some lectors chose to read and moved to ban the practice in many factories by the 1930s, and the rise of factory radio, which delivered controlled, less politically charged content, finished off what remained of the tradition within a generation. 20 jobs, 20 vanished routines that once structured entire American communities, from a boy tapping on windows before dawn to a lector's voice carrying across a cigar factory floor. None of these trades disappeared because the people who did them stopped caring or stopped working hard. They disappeared because a machine, a wire, or a new piece of technology quietly made the human version unnecessary, sometimes within a single decade. The people who held these jobs did not see the end coming any more clearly than we can see what our own daily work might look like 100 years from now. If your family ever told you a story about one of these jobs, a grandfather who cut ice, a grandmother who worked a switchboard, tell us in the comments which one and where they worked. And if there is a forgotten trade we missed here, one your own family remembers that never made this list, tell us what it was called and what it actually involved.